Battle of Edgehill. How King Charles I's faith and arrogance tore England apart. It's the cold morning of October 23, 1642, and England stands on the edge, literally and figuratively. On a frost-covered battlefield at Edgehill, a king who believes he has divine authority faces off against his own subjects, who have had enough of his taxes, his faith, and most importantly, his arrogance. How did it come to this? Why would a king risk it all? What was so infuriating about a prayer book that it sparked rebellion in Scotland and ignited a civil war across 3 kingdoms? As cannon smoke drifts across the fields and Prince Rupert of the Rhine charges recklessly into battle, we're left with more questions. What would happen if the king's army actually won? Could Charles I have simply marched into London, ending the war before it truly began? Why did Prince Rupert, the fiery cavalry commander, let victory slip through his fingers as his horsemen pursued a fleeing enemy instead of securing the win? And what role did the Scots play in this tangled web of rebellion, prayer books, and war councils? It's a tale of arrogance, faith, and consequences, but it's also a story of how small decisions led to colossal mistakes, and how those mistakes plunged an entire country into chaos. Get ready to unravel the layers of a civil war that was far from inevitable, but suddenly, on this day, seemed like the only possible outcome. You'll meet kings, rebels, fiery princes, and defiant parliaments, each with their own schemes, their own goals, and their own tragic flaws. Could it all have been avoided? And what was so special about a tax called ship money that brought the entire country to the brink? Stay with us as we explore the clash of kings, the birth of rebellions, and the political drama that makes modern politics look like a friendly tea party. October 23, 1642, dawned cold and silent. As the mist lifted from the fields near the quiet village of Kinneton, Warwickshire, 2 armies of Englishmen, a once united people now torn apart by political and religious divisions, prepared for battle. The Battle of Edgehill, the first major clash of the English Civil War, was about to unfold. On one side stood the Royalists, loyal to King Charles I, and on the other, the parliamentarians, determined to curtail the king's absolute power. But how did it come to this? To understand why brothers in arms now pointed swords at each other, we must look back to the turbulent years that led to this day. Back to a time when a stubborn monarch and an unruly neighbor to the north set England on the path to chaos. The seeds of the English Civil War were sown long before the armies of King Charles I and Parliament squared off at Edgehill. They were rooted in the king's unshakable belief in the divine right of kings, that his authority came directly from God, and that neither Parliament nor anyone else had the right to question his decisions. Charles had inherited the throne in 1625 from his father, James I, a man who was equally convinced of the sanctity of royal authority, but managed to keep a tenuous peace with Parliament. James, a Scottish monarch who ascended to the English throne after the death of Elizabeth I, had his own set of eccentricities. He believed he was an intellectual giant, though some suspected the only thing larger than his ego was his collection of lavish fur cloaks. Nevertheless, he muddled through, leaving his son a divided kingdom that desperately needed careful management. Charles, however, lacked his father's ability to bend without breaking. He was a proud man, deeply religious and unwavering in his convictions. He believed in High Anglicanism, a branch of the Church of England that leaned heavily toward Catholic traditions. This raised suspicions, as England was still scarred from the religious turmoil of the Tudor dynasty. To many, Charles's leanings felt like a betrayal of the Protestant faith. While King Charles was embroiled in constant bickering with Parliament over finances and governance, trouble was brewing to the north. Scotland. Oh, Scotland, the wild land of misty mountains, fierce clans, and a fiercely independent church. The Scots had embraced the Presbyterian Church, a decentralized form of Protestantism that emphasized the sovereignty of God and rejected the hierarchy of bishops. The Scottish church was deeply ingrained in the hearts of the lowland Scots, and they clung to it with a devotion that bordered on the fanatical. But Charles, sitting on his throne in London, had little interest in Scottish traditions. He saw them as an unruly bunch in need of order, and he was just the man to bring it to them. His solution? imposing the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. A move so misguided, it's like trying to teach a cat how to swim. For the Scots, it wasn't just a royal decree, it was an attack on their very soul. In 1637, Charles, with the encouragement of his trusty advisor, Archbishop William Laud, decided to make his move. Laud, a man whose devotion to Anglican ritual was so intense, he likely ironed his robes while chanting the Lord's Prayer, convinced the king that Scotland would welcome the change. Together, they rolled out the Book of Common Prayer across Scotland. Spoiler alert, the Scots did not welcome the change. The Book of Common Prayer was intended to create uniformity between England and Scotland, but to the fiercely independent Scots, it was nothing short of an insult. The book itself was a compilation of prayers, sacraments, and rites that leaned heavily toward Anglican traditions, which to many Scottish Protestants smacked of Catholicism. The Scots would have none of it. On July 23, 1637, as the new prayer book was read aloud for the first time in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, all hell broke loose. It began with a solitary old woman named Jenny Geddes, who reportedly hurled a stool at the preacher's head while shouting, "Dost thou say Mass in my lug?" Translation, "Are you trying to read Catholic prayers to me?" Soon, the entire congregation erupted into chaos. People began tearing up the prayer books, hurling insults at the clergy, and storming the streets. What started as a minor protest quickly spiraled into full-blown rebellion. Across Scotland, riots erupted, and the cry of "No bishops, no prayer book" echoed from every corner. Charles was horrified. He had expected compliance, not revolt. But the Scots were not about to back down. In 1638, they drew up the National Covenant, a document that rejected the imposition of the prayer book and reaffirmed their commitment to Presbyterianism. Charles, never one to take a challenge lightly, decided that military action was the only solution. In 1639, Charles raised an army and marched north to put down the Scottish rebellion in what became known as the First Bishops' War. But there was one small problem. He didn't have enough money. You see, wars are expensive, and Charles had been running the country without parliament and its purse for over a decade. His army was poorly trained and ill-equipped, while the Scots, bolstered by their fiery religious zeal, were prepared for war. The king's forces met the Scottish army near Berwick-upon-Tweed, and nothing much happened. It turns out both sides were more interested in negotiating than fighting, and Charles agreed to a truce in the Treaty of Berwick. It was a humiliating setback for the king, but the Scots were not yet done. Picture it, 1639, England. King Charles I, the monarch who believed he was as close to God as a man could get without actually becoming lightning, is staring into the abyss that is his empty war chest. His attempt to impose religious uniformity had gone over in Scotland about as well as asking them to enjoy a nice cup of lukewarm tea. The Scots had risen up, waving their covenant like a banner of righteous indignation and ready to give the king a lesson in why you don't mess with their faith. To crush this Scottish rebellion, known as the First Bishops' War, Charles needed an army, and armies, as he soon learned, cost money. Lots of it. But after ruling without parliament for 11 years, Charles had about as much money as a peasant with a gambling addiction. So, on April 13th, he reluctantly summoned parliament for the first time in over a decade. What Charles hoped for was a quick cash grab. He thought parliament would swoon at his royal charm, hand over the money, and then be sent packing like a pesky cousin after Christmas. Instead, what he got was a room full of stubborn, disgruntled politicians who saw this as their golden opportunity to challenge the king. After 3 weeks of back-and-forth bickering that solved precisely nothing, Charles, who had the patience of a ravenous lion, dissolved Parliament on May 5, 1639. The Short Parliament, as it became known, was like a very unproductive family reunion, short, awkward, and filled with unspoken resentment. Join us as we journey back to the dawn of history. From epic battles to pivotal moments of triumph and tragedy, we're committed to uncovering the untold stories that have defined who we are today. Each video is meticulously crafted to transport you to the heart of the action, where you'll witness the struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices of those who came before us. But we need your support to continue our mission. By subscribing to our channel, you'll become part of a community dedicated to preserving and sharing our collective heritage. Together, we'll unlock the secrets of the past and ensure that they're never forgotten. Don't miss out on our latest releases. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on our newest videos, packed with thrilling narratives, stunning visuals, and thought-provoking insights. Subscribe, follow, and embark on an unforgettable journey through history. With Parliament refusing to cooperate, Charles turned to his old favorite, ship money. This was a tax originally levied on coastal towns to fund the navy in times of emergency. The catch? Charles was now demanding it from inland towns too, stretching the definition of emergency so thin you could see daylight through it. People weren't exactly thrilled with paying for a war they didn't understand, against a country they didn't particularly hate. Yet Charles persisted, squeezing what funds he could from the already overtaxed nation, like trying to wring water from a rock. But the Scots were not done. In 1640, they crossed the border again, starting what would become the Second Bishops' War. The Scots were not only angry, but now they were also battle-hardened from their stand against Charles, and they had leadership in the form of the Earl of Leven, also known as Alexander Leslie. And Leslie was no amateur. He had spent the last decade honing his military prowess in the service of Sweden's legendary King Gustavus Adolphus during the 30 Years' War. So when Charles sent his ragtag English forces against them, Leslie's Scots brushed them aside like flies. The Battle of Newburn, fought on August 28, 1640, was Charles's pièce de résistance in military blunders. Leslie's 20,000-strong Scottish army, fueled by religious fervor and some really solid leadership, met the English at the River Tyne. The English, probably praying for divine intervention, which never came, were outmaneuvered and crushed. Leslie's army marched south, taking Newcastle and occupying the northeastern counties of England, marking the first Scottish victory on English soil since 1388. After such a humiliating defeat, Charles was forced to the negotiation table once more, resulting in the Treaty of Ripon. This treaty was more of a Scottish victory lap, as it required Charles to pay the Scots a whopping £850 a day for occupying northern England. In essence, he was paying them to hang around and enjoy the sights, while his financial situation went from bad to someone hide the silverware. If Charles was hoping for a peaceful night's sleep, this treaty gave him nothing but nightmares. By this point, Charles had to do the unthinkable: call Parliament again. Thus, on November 3, 1640, the infamous Long Parliament convened. Unlike the Short Parliament, this one wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Parliament, led by men like the formidable Earl of Warwick and John Pym, saw the king's weakness and moved to strip him of much of his power. It was like a slow-motion coup, all done with the proper legal documents and enough grandstanding to make anyone's head spin. One of the first acts of the Long Parliament was to target Charles' most trusted and despised advisor, the Earl of Strafford. A loyal enforcer of the king's rule, Strafford was accused of treason and, after a lengthy trial, was executed in May 1641. This sent a clear message. The days of absolute royal authority were over. Next up in Parliament's crosshairs was Archbishop Laud, the architect of Charles' religious policies. Laud, who had played a significant role in antagonizing the Scots, was arrested and imprisoned. His eventual execution in 1645 was a symbol of Parliament's complete rejection of Charles's meddling with religious affairs. As if things weren't bad enough for Charles, Parliament passed the Grand Remonstrance in November 1641. This was essentially a laundry list of grievances against the king, accusing him of everything from mismanagement to tyranny. It was a bold declaration that Parliament was now the true power in England, and Charles was to act more like a figurehead than a monarch. The king's authority was crumbling, and to add insult to injury, a Catholic revolt erupted in Ireland around the same time. Thousands of Protestant settlers were slaughtered, and the rest fled, creating an army of refugees. The situation was so dire that everyone agreed an army was needed to quash the rebellion. But there was one problem. Who would control this army? Parliament no longer trusted Charles with military power, and Charles, in turn, trusted Parliament about as much as a cat trusts a room full of rocking chairs. By January 1642, tensions reached their peak. Convinced that several members of Parliament were plotting against him, Charles took the extraordinary step of leading 400 soldiers into the House of Commons to arrest 5 MPs, John Pym, John Hampden, Arthur Hazelrig, Denzil Halls, and William Strode. But when Charles arrived, sword in hand and soldiers at his back, the 5 men had already fled. His plan had been leaked. The king stood awkwardly in Parliament, staring at the empty seats of his intended victims, and uttered the now famous line, "I see that the birds have flown." It was the final, public humiliation. And so, the stage was set for war. London erupted in outrage. The king and his royal family swiftly retreated to Windsor Castle, leaving the capital behind them in a huff of royal embarrassment. They packed up their belongings like they were fleeing a bad holiday. But this wasn't a vacation. This was the beginning of something far darker. At Windsor, Charles brooded, still convinced that he was the rightful defender of England's traditional constitution and the Elizabethan church doctrine. After all, he believed in the divine right of kings, and surely God was on his side, right? Meanwhile, across Westminster, Parliament wasn't so sure. They argued that Charles had proven himself untrustworthy and dangerous, stripping him of his remaining constitutional powers and calling for radical religious reform. With the nation split between royalists who feared Parliament's power and parliamentarians who feared Charles's tyranny, the situation spiraled towards civil war. By early 1642, the king made a bold move. He marched north to York, seeking to rally support. His goal? To secure control over Ireland, which had recently erupted in Catholic rebellion. Thousands of Protestants had already been killed, and Parliament, naturally, didn't trust Charles to lead an army to quash the uprising. Parliament itself had no intention of letting Charles raise forces without a leash, but they had no other solution to the Irish crisis. The tension mounted as Charles and Parliament danced around an impending war. In March 1642, Parliament made an unconstitutional power grab, passing the Militia Ordinance. This gave them the power to raise an army without the king's consent, choosing commanders who would answer only to Parliament. Their chosen man for the job was none other than Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Essex came from a long line of troublemakers. His father had attempted a coup against Queen Elizabeth I and lost his head for it. Devereux was no fan of royal tyranny and had earned his stripes as a seasoned military commander. Parliament put its faith in him, hoping his military experience would counter the king's charisma. Not to be outdone, Charles responded with his own unconstitutional move, the Commission of Array. This allowed the king's hand-picked nobles to levy troops for his cause. By this point, 2 armies were taking shape, both bristling with tension, and the drumbeats of war echoed across the country. As Charles's army gathered, he set his sights on Hull, a city brimming with arms and ammunition. Seizing Hull would bolster his war chest and give him the edge he desperately needed. So, on April 29th, the king and his army arrived at the city gates, expecting a warm welcome. But there was a problem. Hull's governor, Sir John Hotham, had flipped to Parliament's side. When Charles demanded entry, Hotham simply barred the gates. The king, who had likely envisioned a glorious triumph, was forced to stand outside like a dejected party crasher. Humiliated once again, Charles retreated with his tail between his legs. The symbolic defeat at Hull would foreshadow many more. Still determined to make a stand, Charles raised his royal standard on August 22, 1642, in Nottingham. This ceremonial act declared war, but in true Shakespearean fashion, even this was marred by disaster. The standard blew over in a violent storm that night, an omen if ever there was one. Even the heavens seemed unimpressed by Charles's boldness. By now, Parliament wasn't just sitting idly by. They'd set up their own headquarters in Northampton, with Essex at the helm, aiming to block Charles's advance on London. The king's forces, however, were pitifully small, just 5 regiments of infantry and 500 cavalrymen. In an effort to bolster his numbers, Charles embarked on a westward march, traveling through Derby, Stafford, and Wellington before reaching Shrewsbury. Along the way, he managed to swell his ranks with men raised by his loyal nobles from North Wales and Lancashire. Meanwhile, Prince Rupert, the king's hot-headed nephew, had taken command of a contingent of the royalist cavalry. Rupert was a force of nature. Born to Frederick V of the Palatinate, who had disastrously tried to seize the throne of Bohemia, Rupert was a veteran of the brutal 30 Years' War. Known for his audacity and fiery spirit, Rupert was Charles's best hope for a cavalry that could dominate the battlefield. In late September 1642, Essex marched towards Worcester, hoping to cut off further royalist reinforcements. He sent 2 cavalry regiments ahead to secure the west bank of the River Severn. But waiting for them at Powick Bridge was Rupert, licking his lips at the chance to crush the parliamentarians. In a rapid and decisive charge, Rupert's cavalry routed the parliamentarians, leaving them in disarray. This was the first true clash of the Civil War, and it gave the royalists a much-needed boost in morale. Buoyed by the victory at Powick Bridge, Charles's army began moving out of Shrewsbury on October 12th. Their destination was London, and Charles had every intention of ending the war before it really began. His forces now swelled to around 13,500 men, and Rupert's cavalry was itching for a fight. On October 23rd, the King's army met Parliament's forces at Edgehill, a cold, frost-bitten battlefield where history would be written. Prince Rupert, as impetuous as ever, launched his cavalry straight at the parliamentarians' left flank, smashing through them in a reckless charge. But Rupert's fatal flaw was overconfidence. Instead of returning to reinforce his infantry, he pursued the fleeing enemy too far, allowing Essex's forces to regroup. Back on the ridge, the 2 armies clashed in a brutal slog, neither side gaining a decisive advantage. As the sun set, both sides were exhausted. The battle ended in a stalemate. No clear winner, no crushing defeat, just the grim reality of a war that was only just beginning. After Edgehill, Charles's hopes of a quick victory were dashed. Yet, buoyed by his initial successes, he marched onward toward London, convinced that he could crush the viper's nest and put an end to the rebellion. But Parliament was far from beaten, and the stage was now set for a protracted and bloody civil war. What had begun as a king's miscalculation had now plunged an entire nation into chaos. And as the winds of war howled across the English countryside, neither Charles nor Parliament could predict just how deep the scars of their conflict would run. It was a crisp autumn morning when the Royalist army, bolstered by recent reinforcements, began to march out of Shrewsbury. Their numbers swelled to around 13,500, and their goal was nothing short of spectacular. London, the beating heart of Parliament's rebellion. The viper's nest, as King Charles I liked to call it. His royal standards fluttered in the cold wind as the soldiers trudged along, steeling themselves for the mission. If they could capture London, this civil war could end before it truly began. At the head of this royal procession was none other than Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the king's fiery, hot-headed nephew. Known for his unbridled eagerness to jump into battle, Rupert had all the self-restraint of a cannonball. The plan was simple: march on London, crush the rebellion, and enjoy a nice cup of victory tea by Christmas. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything, as it turns out. Meanwhile, parliamentarian forces under the command of the Earl of Essex were also on the move. Essex had 12,000 men under, all marching eastward with the same purpose: protect Banbury, a key town, and block any royalist advance toward London. A veteran of the wars in Europe, Essex was calm, collected, and practical, the polar opposite of Rupert. But despite Essex's experience, one thing was clear: both sides were greener in the art of war than they'd like to admit. In their haste to meet their objectives, neither side bothered to send out sufficient scouts. It was the military equivalent of 2 boxers entering the ring without realizing they were about to collide head-on. By October 22nd, Essex's forces had arrived in Kinneton, just a few miles from Banbury, while King Charles had made camp in the nearby town of Edgecote, blissfully unaware of the parliamentarians' proximity. On the night of October 22nd, King Charles convened a council of war at Edgecote. The grand plan was to send a brigade of 4,000 men to seize Banbury the next day. A solid plan, except for the slight hiccup that Essex's entire army was sitting just 3 miles away. Details, right? As the king's troops dispersed into billets across the Wormington Hills for the night, Prince Rupert rode off to Wormington to rest his horses and perhaps blow off some steam. By sheer luck, or fate, depending on your perspective, Rupert's men managed to capture a quartermaster's party from Essex's army that had strayed too far from home. After some friendly questioning, read, probably not so friendly, Rupert discovered that the entire parliamentarian force was camped right under their noses in Kinneton. By midnight, Rupert had sent scouts to confirm the news, and by 3 a.m. on October 23rd, King Charles was made aware of Essex's presence. The king's exhausted messengers began dispatching orders to gather the troops at Edgehill Heights, a ridge overlooking the fields below. As dawn approached, one stark fact became clear. The king's army now stood between Essex and London. They could simply bypass Essex and march unopposed to the capital. But no. Instead of a march to glory, the royalist leadership opted to face Essex in battle. After all, what was the point of having a civil war if you couldn't enjoy a good old-fashioned brawl every now and then? As the sun rose on that cold Sunday morning, the two armies stared each other down across the gentle slopes of Edgehill. The field was a mix of arable land and meadow, perfect for growing crops, less so for staging a decisive battle. On the parliamentarian side, Essex calmly organized his forces, confident in his infantry and artillery. His commanders, including Sir William Balfour and Philip Stapleton, stood ready. Meanwhile, the royalists assembled, with Sir Jacob Astley leading the infantry and Prince Rupert champing at the bit with his cavalry. King Charles, though inexperienced in battle, took a hands-on approach. He rode along the ranks, reviewing his troops, giving them what could be described as a royal pep talk. He even expressed a desire to fight alongside his soldiers, but wiser heads prevailed, convincing him to stay safely at the rear with his cavalry guard. After all, a dead king doesn't make for great leadership. At 2 p.m., the stillness was shattered by the roar of artillery. The civil war had officially begun. Not one to twiddle his thumbs, Prince Rupert unleashed his cavalry down the ridge with the ferocity of a man late for dinner. His men crashed into the parliamentarian left flank like a tidal wave, scattering their opponents with ease. The parliamentarian cavalry on both wings was swept off the field, and it seemed like Rupert had delivered a decisive blow. This was it. The king's men could now swing around and strike Essex's forces from the rear, ending the war in a single glorious charge. But then Rupert did what Rupert did best: overreach. Instead of turning back to aid his infantry and press the advantage, Rupert and his men pursued the fleeing enemy far beyond the battlefield. They might as well have been halfway to Scotland before they realized they'd abandoned the rest of the royalist army to fend for themselves. With Rupert's cavalry off on a joyride, Essex saw his opportunity. Two of his reserve cavalry units, led by Sir William Balfour and Philip Stapleton, surged forward, striking the royalist flanks. Sir John Byron's infantry took the brunt of the attack, and in the chaos, Balfour's men even managed to capture some of the royalist artillery. Unbeknownst to them, they came dangerously close to capturing the king's sons, Charles and James, who were caught in the thick of the melee. The battle teetered on the edge of collapse for the royalists. At one point, parliamentarian infantry seized the king's royal standard, a symbolic victory that sent shockwaves through the royalist ranks. But before Parliament could claim the day, Rupert's cavalry finally returned to stabilize the situation. Unfortunately, the damage was done, and the royalists had missed their window to deliver the knockout punch. By dusk, both sides were too exhausted to continue. The battlefield was littered with the dead and dying, and neither army had the stomach to fight into the night. Essex withdrew his battered forces to Warwick, while the royalists, though still holding the field, decided to retreat by morning. In the end, the Battle of Edgehill was a draw, a bloody, chaotic, and indecisive mess that left both sides licking their wounds. King Charles may have missed his chance to crush Parliament early on, but the war was far from over. As the dust settled, one thing became clear. This civil war would be a long and brutal affair, filled with more mistakes, more glory, and a lot more chaos. And for Prince Rupert? Well, maybe next time he'd remember that cavalry can't win a war on their own. But then again, who's to say he'd even try to change? Edgehill was just the beginning. Both sides learned hard lessons that day, lessons that would shape the conflict for years to come. The king would march on London, only to find Parliament ready and waiting. Essex, though bloodied, was far from beaten, And as for Prince Rupert, let's just say he had many more battles to charge into, for better or worse. Join us on this journey through history. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you're always the first to uncover the hidden stories behind the battles that shaped nations. Don't miss out. History is only